Hey everyone, welcome to part two in our coding/JavaScript series. In the last tutorial, we looked at the basics of object-oriented programming concepts. We looked at how we could use JavaScript to access the DOM, find elements within our HTML document, and either change the contents of the elements themselves or style them by adding and removing classes to those elements, all through JavaScript, all through using event listeners and functions that we created ourselves. Today we're gonna build on those concepts. If you haven't watched that tutorial, I encourage you to go back, watch that first. If you're pretty comfortable with JavaScript or the content that was there, we can continue with this tutorial. So here we're going to be again leveraging HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but this time rather than just clicking on elements, highlighting elements, we're going to be building interactions based on scrolling input. And this is great if you're interested in building a Scrollytelling website, which I know many of you are, either for your in-class project or for your MRP. So to do that, we'll be leveraging a couple of different existing assets. One being a JavaScript library called Waypoints. That is, you can find information here on it, but essentially is a very lightweight way to register and trigger events based on scrolling actions. You essentially set waypoints or points on your page, and as your user scrolls to them or away from them, you can trigger events. And what's really nice about this is that it's they have a version of this library built entirely on just plain JavaScript. There are a lot of other ways to accomplish this scrolling or scrollytelling type behavior. Some of them are quite complex. A lot of them will leverage things like jQuery, other types of frameworks and libraries like GreenSocks, or I guess known as JSP now. But this is very elegant and simple in its implementation, and I think it's a great entry point especially if you're new to JavaScript, in order to get this kind of functionality down. So to give you a sense of what we're going to be building today, or what I've already built and be walking you through, here's a Scrollytelling example. And the idea is that as a user scrolls to specific points, known as waypoints. So here, this is a paragraph element. We've also defined this as a waypoint. And then it will essentially trigger an event when it is 100 pixels from the top of the browser. Let's see what happens. So as I scroll and I reach that point, I'm just have this alert pop up here that says this alert was triggered by scrolling down to basic waypoint, which is the ID of this actual element, and it gives me a bit of more information about it. So if I were to inspect this, I can see that this paragraph, in fact, does have an ID called basic waypoint. So again, we're leveraging similar principles that we introduced in our last tutorial, that these objects in our document can be accessed via their ID, and we can trigger events by setting up listeners or triggers associated with those IDs. So what's nice about this waypoints library is that we don't have to set up all those event listeners ourselves. We don't have to write a bunch of different functions for it. Since we're pretty much doing the same thing again and again, a lot of that functionality and heavy lifting is done for us. All we can do right now is really focus on defining what the behavior should be when we reach these certain waypoints. So we can build quite elegant and complex types of interactions out of this. So here's an example of how we might animate an SVG using these waypoints. So below here, I've got an unordered list with what we were going to use as a series of waypoints. So you can't see them right now because I've spaced them all out. But if I actually go into my HTML document here and I open this up, you can see I've got a unordered list here called waypoints list with 4 different steps, and I've given them all their own IDs, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are essentially these paragraphs that you'll see as we scroll down. So as I scroll down to those waypoints, you can see I've got our friendly face SVG I created in our last tutorial. But as I start to scroll to these waypoints or these specific elements, I'm going to use that event to essentially change the CSS classes of this SVG, and will make its appearance change. And in this case, rather than just kind of changing its color, highlighting it, or labeling like we did in its path, we're going to do a few different things with this. So the first thing we're going to do is, as we scroll down and we meet this SVG, I'm going to add a class which actually fixes it in place. So you can see now as I start to scroll, that image stays fixed on my page. If I go back, it moves with the page. And now I can start building on top of this. As I reach the next waypoint, here I'm actually going to start again adding classes to this, removing classes to it. And this time, the classes I'm going to add are actually going to trigger an animation. So here we have this little X-ray box pop up. And to do this, we're actually going to be leveraging a class from something called Animate.css. And again, this is another library. It's not a JavaScript library, but it's a CSS library, just consisting of CSS-based animations. So we can animate in CSS. It's not just about changing the static style of something. We can do things like have entrances and exits, fading in from different directions. So what's really nice about Animate.css is it handles a lot of these transitions. And when you're building these Scrollytelling sites, I think oftentimes we're revealing information, we're hiding information, presenting the right information at the right time to our users. So this is a great library. I wouldn't use some of the the more fancy ones here, but again, kind of being able to fade in and out information at the right time really helps you can build a strong narrative based on just scrolling events. So we now have 2 libraries we're leveraging. Waypoints to say, okay, when should events be triggered based on users' actions? And then Animate CSS, well, what should actually happen when users scroll to those certain points and hit those waypoints? So let's go back to our example. So our first one, we're going to have something animate in. And then we can continue to build on this. So here we've hit a 3rd waypoint, and now we are building on top of that animation, again, leveraging classes from our Animate library. And as I scroll down and hit the last waypoint, I'm going to undo what I did on my very first waypoint and let that SVG no longer be fixed in place and can scroll off. And as I scroll in the opposite direction, you can see, well, this animation is actually just playing in reverse. And again, we're doing the same types of events here. We are scrolling, we're waiting till the user reaches a waypoint and then changing the class on our elements accordingly. Okay, so let's break this down in more detail. So describe the basics of it. Let's see how we're actually implementing this. So I'm going to go into my Visual Studio Code file. Again, this is available in our classes repository. You can pull all these files. This is completed. Just to break down what you're seeing in our index file here, everything should look relatively familiar. We've got our head. We have created a CSS file. So here I've actually got it populated with a few different attributes set up here, properties set up. And you can see in my index file, I have linked to it, my local CSS file. What you'll also notice is that we're linking to an additional style sheet, and this is the Animate.css library. So here we're actually connecting to this library hosted somewhere else on the web, but we can still use the rules that are set up there. And if you like more detail on this, all that information is on the Animate.css website letting you know how you can install it. There's different ways to do it, complex ones, which we're not going to be going into, but essentially what we're doing is just providing this link to the style sheet directly in our head tag. Okay, so going back to our file here, so I'm going to focus on the first section of the body here. So you'll notice right at the beginning I've got information, just a little blurb to start off with. I've got 3 divs here. I've got 2 divs with the class spacer assigned to them. And if I go into my CSS document, spacer, it's pretty simple. All it does is set the height of the div to 100%, essentially to fill the entire browser window from top to bottom. And I've attached a light cyan background to it so we can see it. So all that's really doing is not a lot of functionality from those elements, but if I scroll up here, I'm just doing that to space out my waypoints so we can actually have something to scroll to. So this big, cyan rectangle here, that's my first spacer. If I scroll down, I've got my actual paragraph div, which is here, to which I've assigned it an ID called basic waypoint. And then below that, I've created another div with the spacer class attached to it. So that is creating this first part of our page here, up and down. So you can see, like, as I start to reach this paragraph element, it's triggering this alert that's popping up both when I scroll towards it and away from it. And let's see how we're actually doing that. So I'll go back into my file here. And one thing I'm going to do is skip ahead. I'm going to scroll way past this animating with waypoints section. If I go all the way down to the bottom of my body element, you can see, similar to our last tutorial, I have some JavaScript files embedded here. So the first thing I've got here is a link to the Waypoints library. And here I have it stored locally. So if you look at this path, you can see that in my local files, I have this JavaScript file called noframeworkwaypoints.min.js. If I click into it, it looks like a whole lot of craziness I can't really decipher. But that was essentially pulled from the Waypoints site. So here you can see, again, similar to the Animate.css library that we're using, we can download, but rather than pointing to this framework being hosted somewhere on the web, we have the option here, the instructions getting started, say to download this library, and then within your HTML, create the script tag, and then point to the path where you actually downloaded and are hosting this library. There's other forms of this library. So if you're familiar with jQuery or Zepto, there's versions of the library that work with those. I'd say, again, stick with the no framework, or kind of, I should have this other way of thinking about this is like no dependencies way of using this. So we don't have to worry about integrating with jQuery or any other existing frameworks or libraries. You can just use this as is. And I think this makes the code you're going to be writing, the things that are happening, a lot more transparent. And hopefully you can understand what's happening a bit better by going about it this way. So anyway, I've downloaded a local copy of this, and I have embedded it in my HTML, and I've created a separate JavaScript file that I've just named script.js. And this is very similar to last tutorial. This is one I've just made myself, and this is where I'm going to be writing my code to trigger these waypoints. As you can see here, it's already been populated. So here, everything's been commented. So if you want to go through this, everything is described really, really well here. But the basics of setting up these waypoint events We don't have to worry about adding event listeners. We don't have to worry about setting up functions. Everything is done for us out of the box, which is fantastic. And all that is done by creating new waypoint objects. So these waypoint objects take care of all that stuff that we were talking about last class under the hood. All we have to do is provide a bit of information so this object knows what it needs to connect to and what needs to be triggered, and kind of there's some additional like nice options that we can have as well. So if I go back to the waypoint site, if you actually go through like the getting started section here, it walks you through this really, really well. So the basics of setting this up, once your HTML site is set up, you assign IDs to different elements. You create your waypoint object, and you have to provide just a little bit of information to create this object. And what it's asking for is one, what's the element you're going to use as your waypoint? And we're going to be using the same type of method we used last time by just getting element by ID and passing the name of that element to it. There's a comma. And then you have to define what's called a handler. And a handler is just how this waypoint event should be handled. And what it's asking for typically is to either define a function or call some other function that you have specified. And then that's it. So, very similar to how we handled clicking and hovering last tutorial, this is arguably simpler because we can just specify which element we want to be triggered and what's going to happen once we trigger it. So if I go back to my document here, so let's go through that very, very first example. I know this is pretty busy with other code here. Let me zoom in so we can focus on just this top area here. So what I'm going to do is, one, define my first waypoint. I'm not even going to assign it to a variable. I can if I want, but I can just say create a new waypoint. And then I've got parentheses and curly bracket here. I'm going to say which element is going to be my waypoint. So again, going back to my index.html, I'm going to scroll all the way up. I've got this paragraph, which I've already given the ID basic waypoint. So coming back in here, I will get that element, basic waypoint, comma, and now I have to define what's going to happen. So the handler, we can define a function, and what's really nice about waypoints is that it accepts a direction as a parameter out of the box already. So we can already tell if we are scrolling up or scrolling down to this element. So that gives us the ability to define logic around that. So maybe we want one event to happen when we're scrolling down to something and another event to happen when we scroll up to something. And then, so all I'm doing is in this function, so I can get the direction, and I'm doing something really, really simple. This is an out-of-the-box alert function that's being called, and that just kind of has that pop-up that you see in your browser. And I'm just saying, putting a string together to fill that alert. And I'm just saying this alert was triggered by scrolling to, I'm going to state the direction, to, and then what's another great thing about waypoints is that we can, within this function we are calling, we can access which element would triggered this event. So it's very similar to the event.target property we were using in our last tutorial. But again, waypoints does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So we can just say this, and this is specific to the element that triggered it. And I can say this element.id, so I can restate the name. And I can even get information like what was the trigger point in pixels. So I can say, again, this waypoint, I should say this is not really the element, this is the waypoint object. But from the waypoint object, I can get the element field and then the ID field from that. And then again, from the waypoint object, known as this, I can get the trigger point, which is measured in pixels. So like how far from the top of the page did we have to scroll till we actually had that triggered. And then the last thing, so we close off this function, so we've defined it here. we can pass, sorry, got rid of that comma, and I got rid of everything. Let's go back here. Optionally, we can add an offset to the trigger point, which is great. So by default, this waypoint event gets triggered as soon as this element reaches the top of the browser. And you may think, for some things that's okay, but if you want to have control over, what your user is looking at and how you're building your narrative, maybe you want to be able to offset that a bit. So we can actually offset that by a specified number of pixels. So I'm going to say, rather than it reaching the very, very top of the page, I want you to trigger when this element is 100 pixels away from reaching the top of the page. That's when I want the event to trigger. So let's go back and see that happen again. So I'll go back to my page. And then, so as I scroll down, so this is my waypoint element. So I've created a waypoint object. It is pointing to this element. And then as I'm about 100 pixels away from the top of the screen, the alert comes up, and you can see this information is now populated. So I know I was scrolling down, so I can pass the direction. I know the ID, it's called basic waypoint, and I know that I am 197 pixels from the top of the page. And let's actually verify that. If I actually make this a bit smaller, this window a bit smaller, let's see if that actually happens again. So you can see, with a smaller window, and I scroll down, I'm now triggering this at 853 pixels from the top of the page, which is nice. Which means like this still works with responsive pages. This works if you're spacing things out based on my spacers here are just setting it to 100% of the window, the height of the window. So if I change the window, it changes the size of my spacing, which means regardless that waypoint is going to be triggered pretty much relative to the same point, regardless of different screen sizes. I said regardless a lot there. Regardless. So that is the basics of setting up waypoints and triggering events for scrolling. I can change these values here. So if I just want offset by 0, I can change my function here. Add something in like that, and all that gets taken care of. So now, there's no offset, so this waypoint needs to reach exactly the top of the page, and then it gets triggered, and you can see that message has been updated as well. Okay, we'll get rid of that. Okay, so that's the basics of setting up your waypoints and setting up your functions. Now, when we want to actually start animating or building a narrative with these scrolling events, what we really want to do now is really just focus on defining these handler functions in a bit more detail. So if I go back to my page here and I go to this next part with animating waypoints, I've got these 4 different waypoints spaced out, and they are triggering different events. Each one of those events is a little bit different, and going the opposite direction, they're behaving differently as well. So let me zoom out here a bit. If I go back into my index page, so the part I just described was this part up here, right, with our basic waypoint and our spacers. If I scroll down a bit, I've got a few different elements set up. The first one is I've got this big div with the ID container, and I built this just to house all the different waypoints and help keep them organized. Within that container, I've got an unordered list, which I've given the ID waypoints list, and then within that list, I have a bunch of different elements, or just list elements, I should say, each with their own IDs, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I go to my JavaScript file. I'm going to skip past this part to begin with. We're going to make some more waypoints. So I'm going to be following the exact same pattern I used up above. So I want these 4 waypoints, and again, I'm going to follow the same pattern. So I'm going to create a new waypoint object, say which element is going to trigger or be the element that triggers this waypoint, and then define some function. And you can see here, really, the function is just getting more complex from what we had up above. And down below, I still have the option to define an offset. Notice here I'm defining an offset by percentage, so you can have like an actual, if you just put in a number, it's pixels from the top of the screen. But if you really want a responsive site, you can also define a percentage. So if you're on a phone or a website, what I'm saying is when that element has reached 25% of the screen, or from the top of the page, that's when this is going to trigger. So again, I basically set up 4 different objects: waypoint for step 1, a waypoint for step 2, waypoint for step 3, and a new waypoint for step 4. And that's it. Everything is set up. Again, I've got these handler with functions, and I can read the direction. And now I can start using that to animate other parts of my page. So what are the other parts of the page? And this is going to kind of tie back into what we talked about last class around working with SVGs, assigning IDs to parts of your SVGs, and changing the classes on those elements. Okay, so I'm going to go into Figma, and in Figma, you'll recognize this happy little face I created for our last tutorial. I've created a very basic storyboard of an animation that I want to now build in my site. So here you can see, I've just created a few frames. There's no text or anything. It's very, very simple. And I've even prototyped out how some of the behavior should happen right within Figma. So I've used the Smart Animate and prototyping tools. If I actually run this, so here I don't actually have scroll events, but I just wanted to preview, well, how might some of these behaviors happen. I'm just going to click. So maybe on the first waypoint it looks like this. Next waypoint we're going to have this sort of X-ray device fly in. And the last one we're going to have the skull fade in. So at least I'm working out the composition of my, we can call it a shot or my element, some of the motion, like where the elements are going to come into and exit from, and then how some of those transitions are going to work. So we're going to have this kind of bounce in effect and this fade effect for the skull to come in. And I can start seeing if I've got sort of equivalent animations out of the box from Animate.css. So I think that looks good. So to get these elements prepared for use in my actual web document, think of that my storyboard. Here's the actual element I'm going to export. So if I look at this in a bit more detail, you can see everything's overlapped here. But essentially, if I turn off some of these layers, I've got this background element. I've got a head, which I've used in my last tutorial. I think it's the exact same one. Yep, you can see all the layers are still named. I've added this X-ray vector on top, and I've added the skull one on top of that. So I can start to imagine how these might start to build in. But I want them all on when I'm doing my export. And again, I'm going to just start doing the same thing. So I'm going to make sure under my export settings, I can add an export, change that to SVG, and then also make sure I include ID attributes. So all that's already set up. I have something to access via the DOM. And then I can export my animation, and that gets exported. So I'm not going to resave that. But essentially, similar to before, once that's exported, I can copy and paste that directly into my my HTML. So here, you can see right here is the SVG that I've decided to add in. For some reason, I put it inside another container, which I call box. I think that was mostly from when I was kind of prototyping these behaviors before I had actual SVG to place. I think that's okay. But essentially we'll be animating this and everything within it, and you can see in detail that all those IDs that were assigned are there. So I've got the head, the face, eyes, everything is in there. Even down below here, so I've added comments. This didn't come out in the export, but just so you can find things in this file a bit easier. That X-ray element that I want to fade in, or sorry, to bounce in, and that skull element down here that I want to fade in at the third waypoint are all specified. Okay, so I've got the actual elements laid out as a list that are going to trigger my events. And now I've got the actual elements that I'm going to do something with. So these are not the waypoint elements, but these are things I'm going to want to animate or change the style of in response to hitting those other waypoint objects. First thing I'm going to do is actually, if you'll notice here, I've got in my CSS file, a few properties already listed here just to set up my page so things are in the right positions. So I talked about this spacer class I already had. I've also, are assigning some attributes to the container. So the first thing I want to do, is as I scroll to this point, this SVG, it's embedded in my document. I want it to stay fixed in place. Right? That's my first event. So how am I going to do that? And I'm actually going to do that the same way I've been doing other things with in our previous tutorials. I'm going to swap classes in and out. So as a default state for this, I'm going to take my container and I'm going to set it to relative. And this is really just means that this is going to allow us to take that box element that we're going to be using later on and allow it to be set in an absolute position so it stays in its spot. So to kind of summarize what's happening, we've got, let's go back here. We've got our container. Scroll down here. Holding everything. Within that container, we've got this box element, which is just holding our SVG. So as to start, I want this box to sit next to my waypoints. I want it to sort of be off here on the right. So I'm going to position this box relative to the container that's housing everything. And that's what I'm doing with this CSS I've got here. So all that means is by default, this container needs to be set to relative. And that's only because this box I want to set to absolute. So I'm saying within the container, we're going to set, make sure that box stays right at the top and give it a big margin of about 60%. So just to show you what I mean, if I were to change this to say 20%, go back here, refresh this, you can see that box element that's holding my SVG is now just 20% from the left. And I don't really want that because it's covering my text. So I'm going to go back in, change this to 60%. And you'll also notice I've got this other rule here to specify the margins of the list items in my which are my waypoints. So if I go back here and look at these list items, so I am selecting the unordered list with the ID waypoints and then specifying for each list tag within that element, we're going to style it in a certain way. And that's what's happening here. So find waypoints list, find those list elements, and adjust the margins. So this works, I could specify the top, right, bottom, left margins, or I can do them all in a single rule. just by 4 numbers. A good rule of thumb is just think about the hands of a clock and start at 12 o'clock. So this is like top, so 12 o'clock, um, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. So in other words, top, right, bottom, left. So I'm saying, within this container, I'm going to space out these elements. So 50% of the screen above, 50% of the screen below, 60% of the screen from the right, and then 0 from the left, which ends up sticking my objects right over here. Let me refresh that again. So you can see really 0 from the left, about 50% from the top, 50% from the bottom, and 60% from the right. So this just kind of keeps, even without my waypoints, this is really just laying out these elements. So I want to make sure that I've got a good amount of space between them. If I want this animation to play faster or slower, maybe I would just change the distance between them. So I could, if this was, say, 10 and 10, saved and went back here, refreshed, you can see my waypoints are a lot closer to one another, and that animation is going to be triggered almost instantaneously as I scroll through them. So it's a bit of a, you need to feel out, how much scrolling makes sense for you to build your animation around and pace out your narrative really well. And I found that just for this, at least, these were the magic numbers for me. Okay, so that takes care of what we're doing here. So these 3 rules here essentially just lay out our page. And then below that, I've defined a few other classes, or rules for these classes. One is called isFixed, and this is what is going to take essentially any object that this class is, or any element this object is assigned to, and just fix it in place. So it's no longer going to move. It's no longer going to move with the elements of the page as we scroll. And I'm also going to fix it in a certain position. So I'm going to fix it at 25%. Now you may also notice this exclamation point important added to it. So this helps deal with the conflicts and specificity of your CSS rules. So if you've got different classes or different rules affecting the same attributes, so you've got multiple classes or multiple rules changing the position, adding this important tag makes it important. So it says, regardless of some of these specificity rules, follow this rule above any other rules. So this makes sure that just, without a shadow of a doubt, anything isFixed is attached to is actually going to be fixed and be in this position. So we're actually going to use this as as in our function for our first waypoint. So a few other classes, I'll just describe them here. IsBottom. This is going to, we'll be using this later on, but this will make sure that we can eventually, when we want our box to no longer be fixed and continue to scroll with the page, this allows us to sort of reposition that box so it looks like it's kind of at the bottom of our container element, and it sort of smoothly gets picked up and moved away. So it's not about, if we were just to kind of remove the isFixed class, we'd probably see that element jump back to its original spot. This is going to allow us to, keep our box fixed in one spot, and then when we're done doing whatever we want to it, we're going to let it go and leave it in whatever position it was last left in. And then hidden, this should look familiar to you. This just hides elements, right? Sets the opacity to 0. A good way of hiding things like that X-ray element and that skull that I'll be fitting in. Okay, so these are essentially all the classes we're going to be using, aside from these are all the rules we'll be using, aside from all the Animate.css animations that we'll be bringing in. So let's go, just make sure I reset this to how it's supposed to look. Yep. So let's start looking at what's happening here. So I'm going to go back to my JavaScript now. And so this section, let's make more waypoints. This is all the logic for these waypoints in the animation section. The first thing I'm going to do, similar to last lesson, is I'm going to define a few variables, a few constants for some of the elements that I'm going to be working with. So the first is really, even though I exported all my elements and assigned IDs to them, I really just want to be working with that top level box object. So not even part of my SVG, just the container for the entire SVG. That X-ray element that I want to bounce in, and that skull element that I want to fade in eventually. And now, so by default, if I look at the SVG I exported, all those elements are visible. They're one on top of the other. So I'm actually going to do, similar to what I did in the last tutorial, is just go ahead and take that hidden class, and I'm going to add it to those elements. I could do it in the HTML directly if I wanted to. I have those available here, so they're already ready. So if I were to actually, let's see, remove these lines of code, go back to my site and refresh it, you can see, so that's how the SVG would look. You get some funny behavior happening here if those things were just allowed to be visible. So I'll come back here. So these two lines here just by default hide those elements in my SVG. So let's look at how we're going to program our first waypoint. So we already got the elements. So we're going to get step 1, right, which is our first item in the list. And now here we're going to just define the function that gets called when we reach this waypoint. So here I'm going to add a bit of logic because I don't want the same thing to happen when I'm scrolling down as when I'm scrolling up. So really I want my animation to play one way when I'm scrolling down. I essentially want the opposite to happen when I'm scrolling up. So I have a way to reset things, and the users can kind of move back and forth and really have control over the narrative. So here I'm going to use conditional statements. And I'm going to say if, and I'm going to essentially assess the value of the direction parameter that's coming through. So if the direction, and then in JavaScript, we've got 3 equal signs, equals down. So that's what gets passed by the waypoint object itself. It's literally just up or down in quotes. So if the direction is down, I'm going to take my box element class and I'm going to add the isFixed class to it. And we know that's going to keep it in place. Else, so if we are not scrolling down, in other words, if we hit this waypoint when we're scrolling up, I want to remove this isFixed class. So essentially don't fix it in space in place anymore. And then we're going to offset this waypoint by 25%. So again, I don't want this to happen right when the text reaches the top of the screen. I want it to happen when it's about 25% away from the top of the screen. So let's see what that looks like. So here's my waypoint. Here you can see, let's actually inspect this. Hopefully there's enough room here on the screen. Let me make this bigger. Let's grab our box. You can see there's no class assigned to it just yet. And then as I begin to scroll, you can see 25% away from the top, I've added the isFixed class to my boxed ID, and then now that rule is taken over. So it's now no longer absolutely positioned within the container. It is now fixed within the screen, and that's just going to stay there unless I scroll up, in which my handler says to remove that class. So that's all I'm doing. So this is very similar to what we're doing with clicking on objects, very similar to what we're doing with hovering over objects, except now we've got just a different type of input triggering these events. It's these scrolling events. So you can see that stays there. Now, as I get to my second waypoint, Let's go down here. Now triggered by step 2. Again, I'm going to have this conditional happen. So if I'm scrolling down, this should hopefully look familiar to you. So we are going to now look at that X-ray element that was hidden, right? And we are going to use, again, the class list property and call the remove method. And here, so here, what I first thing I want to do is remove the hidden class that I assigned to it way back up here. So this allows it to be seen. And you might also notice that we're removing the animate bounce out down class. Well, I've never seen that. We've never defined it. So this is actually something we're going to get from our Animate.css. And let me walk through this logic entirely before we come back to this. Because right now, that class is, it doesn't, why are we removing it? It's not even on there. At the same time, we are going to add classes. So we're going to remove these classes that are hiding it, and we're going to add these 2 classes. So we can add multiple classes in a single line here. The first one is called animate__animated. And this is a necessity for using the Animate.css library. So if you actually come to this site here and you go through the getting started, you can see it breaks down like what these actual animations are. You can look at them in the in detail if you like to see like how the CSS rules actually work. But essentially what we will be using are some utility classes and animation classes to get this started. So if you actually look at the basic usage of it, so if you want to run any of these animations, let me zoom in here, you essentially first need to add this class, animate.animated. That just allows you to access all the animations, and then add a class name associated with a particular animation, in this case, animate.bounce. So if I come to this site and I look at kind of things I want, I think I want the bounce in, I want bounce in up. That's pretty close to what I had in my Figma animation. So if I come back here, I say once I reach this waypoint, I'm going to add this animate.animated class to just access this library. And then second, I'm going to add the animate__bounce in up. And to find this, you can actually inspect these in more detail. So bounce in up. I can copy the class name to the clipboard right here. If I copy that, come back, paste this in, it's exactly the same. So that's just there if you want to see it again. That allows me to one, make sure the the element is no longer hidden, and 2, add a CSS class which triggers that animation. Now, so that handles what happens when I'm scrolling down. So let me go back to my site here. As I'm scrolling down, let's find this X-ray element. So you can see right now it has that class hidden assigned to it. As I scroll down to the second waypoint, you can see that's been changed. So hidden is removed, and that animate.animated is added, and the animate.bounce in and up is there. Now, that's great as I'm scrolling down, but users are going to move back and forth. So if I go back up, I want to hide this X-ray element again. So I'm going to have to define some logic to move it out. So as you can see, as I move it away, I still have that animate.animated class, but I've added the animate bounce out and down class instead. So going back to my script here, you can see that now. So if I'm scrolling down, I'm doing one thing. As I'm scrolling up, So I'm going to remove that animate.bounceItUp. So that's what I added here. And then I'm going to add, again, animate.animated. You need to add it every time. Essentially, you trigger an animation. And I'm going to add this animate.bounceOut and down. So this adds it to it. So, and this is why in my statement up here, I had the opposite, where I am actually removing the animate bounce up and down. And this is to account for the fact that users might be scrolling up and down a lot. So I need to account for all those instances. So here, if I'm scrolling up, you'll notice that animate.bounce and down is still there, right? I added it to move it out. So as I scroll back down again, I need logic to remove that bounce out and make sure that just my bounce in and up is there. So, and you can see those classes switching back and forth as I move up and down. So that's essentially the logic that's happening here. So if I'm scrolling down, add some classes and remove others. As I'm scrolling up, we'll do the inverse. Remove the ones we added and add the ones that we removed previously. For the next part of our animation, we're going to do essentially exactly the same thing, but now use a different set of animations. So here we go. I've scrolled down. I'm going to access now the skull object. And as I scroll down and I hit the third waypoint, you can see the same thing happened, right? That hidden class was removed. I added the animate_animated class, but now I've added a different animation, an animate fade in. If I go down to my third waypoint, you can see it looks really similar. Again, same logic. Conditional if we're scrolling down, remove some classes, add others. If we're scrolling up, do the inverse. Remove the ones we added, add the ones we removed. And that allows us to have this really nice kind of back and forth. So fade out, fade in, bounce out, bounce in. So we can keep building on this. So if you're building a Scrollytelling site, you can just kind of continue to set up different waypoints, continue to set up the same kind of logic around adding and removing classes. And you can use the animate library. You can add or remove any classes you want. So similar to what we did before, if you want to change the color of particular elements in your SVGs, if you want to hide or remove labels that are coming in and out at certain times, you can just essentially hook them up to these events instead of those event listeners that we created in our last tutorial. So now for the last waypoint, we're doing something a little bit different, but essentially under the hood, doing something very similar to the other patterns. When we get to the bottom here, this last waypoint, you can see there, we're going to actually go back up to the box here. So if you remember at the first waypoint, we set this class is fixed. So, and that's why it's been, staying in the same spot for all our other animations. As we get to the very bottom, you're going to see that class switches to is bottom, and that's that class I described right at the beginning of this part of the lesson here. Where now at this point, if I continue to scroll, you can see it's no longer fixed in place. It is actually just moving with the rest of the screen now. And again, to do that, very, very similar, right? So get the element, define a function, have a conditional. If the direction is going down, we are going to remove the is fixed and add the is bottom. And then if we're going the opposite direction, we're going to do the inverse. Now I'll show you why we need this is bottom class. If I take this out and say we're just adding this is fixed class and removing it, I'll show you what happens here. So say we are up here and we scroll down, so we are now fixed. We are animating our first waypoint, animating with our next waypoint, and we get to the bottom. If we just remove the is fixed, it just disappeared. And it didn't disappear, but it really just jumped back to its original spot, which was way up here. We just can't see it. So that's why we actually need to not just undo the classes that we added, we need to actually create a new class to reposition it in a new spot. This is a little bit trickier to get just right, but if I were to refresh this, you can see it's now in the right spot. A lot of this took a bit of manual tweaking. There's other ways to get that down right, but if I go back to my CSS document here, I'm essentially uh, um, overriding so uh, when I remove the isFixed class, remember that these important rules were overriding this position information. Essentially, we're jumping back to implementing this rule. So it's saying I take that box, take that image, place it right at the top of the container, and keep the margin the same. So it's jumping all the way back. So by adding this class, we're saying, okay, you know what? Don't quite, don't put it back to the top of the container. We're going to say like, hey, have some flexibility with where it's positioned from the top. And at the bottom, we're going to stick it about 300 pixels from the bottom because that seems to be just about right. That's kind of where our last waypoint sort of falls, and the end of our container sort of ends up. And we get this sort of positioning. You'll see it snap a little bit if you're paying like really close attention, but for all intents and purposes, it does its job by just kind of manually repositioning it there. Okay, and then below there's just another spacer. So this is a really, I think, probably the simplest way to implement a Scrollytelling site. You're leveraging the same type of behavior again and again, built on these really two simple libraries, Waypoints, which is a JavaScript library, and Animate.css, which is a CSS animation library. But fundamentally under the hood, we are doing something very similar to what we were doing in our last tutorial, right? It's essentially getting interacting with the DOM, right? Getting the elements that we want to interact with or change, registering or listing for particular events. This just happened to be scrolling events, and then adding or removing classes as needed. And defining those classes either in our CSS or from this external library. So you can use this to build your own Scrollytelling site, whether it be simple alerts or changing contents to more advanced animations, all with literally, let's see here, 6 lines of code is all you need to really set these things up, and then it's really just a matter of having really good previs documentation, prototyping out some of your animations, getting the pacing right, and you'll probably be spending most of your time just building the structure of your page to make sure your waypoints are spaced out properly, and your elements are positioned well. So you can take a look at our Bitbucket site for these project files. They'll be complete, everything is well commented, and you'll hopefully follow along with this video to build your own. So in the last part of this series will be again kind of riffing off this scrolling behavior to provide a few more advanced interactions and capabilities. We'll actually be building a flipbook animation using scroll events. So rather than just sort of triggering these relatively simple class changes, could we do something like play an entire keyframed animation back and go from there? We'll also be looking at some more complex JavaScript interactions, looking at how to build something like a simulated chatbot experience. So stay tuned for those tutorials. Otherwise, have fun playing with this Scrollytelling example.